to begin?
Okay, give me a second. We're live.
Good morning, everyone, or afternoon, evening, depending upon where you are. It's great to see everyone back. Hope your return journeys home went well. We have some work today. We have a morning session and an evening session, my time. So today, in the morning session, our goal is to approve the going concern and PI project listed entities and PI project proposals. Josephine will take the lead in walking us through any revisions to it. I think we're at the point that the real goal is to make sure the project proposal properly lays out all of the public interest issues, the objectives, the scope of the work that will lead us to a high quality outcome in the standard. That's still to be determined, but ensures that we'll do so by having a robust due process that includes a broad consultation and input from our stakeholders. So keep that in mind. And, I'd really want to focus on the substantive issues that lead to that outcome. We're at the point that I think, unless it's a substantive issue, that wordsmithing is probably not the most useful at this point. But again, make sure you raise substantive points during the public session today, and we'll be responsive to that. Josephine, I turn it over to you.
Thank you, Tom. Hello, everybody. Of course, first, we always thank our staff. So thanks to Sally and Kalina and Billy, and of course to the task force members for all their hard work on the turnaround process. Hugely appreciated. Today, the intention is to report back really on just the 4 or 5 more substantive comments we discussed at the board meeting last week, or we heard from the CAG or SMP AG, and then we're going to hand back to Tom and go through any substantive comments you might have. Before I start, Sue reminded me when she started audit evidence last week, there are some changes in teams going forward. So I do want to extend my thanks to Susan Jones and Renee for all their hard work and contributions at our working group meetings, bringing us to this point now. So thank you for that. So Michelle, if we could have the slides. Thank you. If you could move to the next slide, please. Thank you. There we go. Okay, so these are really the 5 areas we wanted to report back on. So first of all, in terms of the introduction, in response to the board and the CAG comments, we have added text that has extended the risks and uncertainties to include war, as well as the global pandemic. And war is terminology that we do use in ISO 600, so we were comfortable for using that specific word in the project proposal. And as discussed as well, we also elevated the key enhancements made to the auditor's report in 2015 in relation to going concern, and yet we elevated that from a footnote to give it more prominence in the project proposal. In terms of the project objectives, we did have a comment that the project objectives were stated at quite a high level, and this might imply, therefore, there was going to be a more comprehensive revision of the standard than actually you could see in the proposed actions. So in response, we clarified in the lead-in that the proposed actions are intended to address the project objectives along with all the other context around the key issues as well. We have, in terms of the bear with me, in terms of objective B, bear with me, I'm just trying to think where we are. Sorry, bear with me. So here we go. So in terms of objective B, which now speaks to strengthening to the auditor's evaluation, as that is the purpose and focus of the targeted revisions. And we've actually now carried that wording through to the project actions as well. It's also an acknowledgement that the auditor may already be actually performing a more robust evaluation of management's going concern assessment in the context of the current standard. But the intention is, of course, to strengthen that evaluation. In terms of objective C, as agreed with the board, what we've done is we've now changed that wording and it's now aligned with the forward project proposal. So not to imply that a definitive outcome has been predetermined in respect to the type of reporting or communication requirements. In terms of section 5, the key issues and related proposed actions, there are quite a number of changes in these in response to board suggestions and comments. And then, of course, there's been some wording alignment, of course, following through to the actions, of course. But we did also get feedback to align the wording more tightly with what we heard too. So essentially, the more substantive changes relate to the timeline, external information sources, terminology and transparency. So in terms of the timeline, the key issue here has been split into two and supplemented with some stakeholder comments that when considering the period of assessment, the requirements of the accounting framework also have to be taken into account. And then when it comes to information from sources to the entity, again, this key issue here has been split into two. So the more general reflection on external sources of information is separated from the third-party support point. And we've also aligned the wording of the external sources with the audit evidence description there. This was also reworded to more closely align with the feedback we received from stakeholders too. And then in terms of terminology, the description of the key issue was supplemented to include those stakeholder views who noted that some financial reporting frameworks may define these terms differently. And then in terms of transparency, edits were made in response again to comments that the key issues were stated in a definitive manner. In terms of the scope section, we did make some changes to the standard setting actions, some of which, as I've mentioned, are alignments with wording used. So you should see all of the same thing following through. There is a new paragraph 34 added to emphasize that notwithstanding that our ISAs are actually framework neutral, our standard setting activities as part of this project do need to take into account any developments or requirements in the international financial reporting requirements. So that's the IFRSs and of course the IPSASs as well. And that now sits, as we discussed, above that table. So it's in relation to any actions that we might undertake. And then in terms of the timeline, it now recognises the point made by CAG and one of our board members that subsequent events should be taken into account when evaluating the reasonableness of management's assessment period. In terms of information from sources external to the entity, again, in response to CAG and board comments, readily available has been removed. And in addition, intent has been extended to intent and ability. And that reflects the fact that both need to be considered when looking at third-party support. So change there. In terms of professional skepticism, we have reformulated the second bullet to be more reflective about how bias could present itself. And the example action verbs have now been removed to align with the draft CUSP guidelines. And then in terms of transparency, we have made some edits here in response to board comments regarding the timeliness of communications with those charged with governance. And of course, we've removed the CAM-like star reference in the last bullet of action 10, so as not to predetermine what that material would be. And then we also, of course, extended the list of jurisdictional initiatives to include the AICPA's going concern standard. And then moving on to the next box, we have updated the section on non-authoritative guidance to recognise in the course of the project that, of course, the development of non-authoritative guidance may be considered as appropriate. In other actions, paragraph 40, we have made reference to the ongoing engagement and dialogue in the course of the project with the IAASB more prominently. And of course, we've added IAASB to the list of relevant stakeholders there. And then in ongoing activities, we have enhanced the material on ongoing activities with other task forces in response to the board's suggestions and editorial comments. And we've also put them in alphabetical order because there were quite a few comments about which should come first. So we thought alphabetical is probably the best way forward. So Tom, that actually concludes our report back to the board. So thank you, over to you.
Okay, thank you, Josephine. Vili, is there anything you'd like to add before we go on with our discussion, or should we wait to the board input?
No, nothing to add at this point. I think just for purposes of staff so that we can follow if there are any further changes when board members comment, to just be clear on which section are you referring to and which paragraph in that section, so we can just do it as efficiently as possible.
Okay, thank you. I'll take board interventions now. Any hands? Chun-Wei?
Thank you, Tom, and good evening from Singapore. Thank you, Josephine and team, for the great work in turning this around. I'm very supportive of all the changes that's been made. I think the enhancement has been great. I only have one comment, if I may just raise it, is on the proposed actions, so paragraph 35 now, and the second one, which is on the timeline. I really like the switching around of the bullets and the way it's being drafted, including the reference to subsequent events. So thank you for that. The only point that I have is on the, extend the timeline to at least 12 months from the date of approval or date the auditor's report is signed, notwithstanding the fact that the leading sentence comes with the word consider, and that, we have paragraph 34 now that talks about that, interaction with the financial reporting framework. I think that bullet, if you look at it, on a standalone basis, it still look a little bit absolute. And I think we have heard enough from our stakeholders that it's absolutely clear that we can't do it in a unilateral way. So I'm just wondering whether they want to put that caveat back there, the one in doing so that it's very clear and obvious that it's linked up, or do we want to maybe consider just changing it to say that we will explore aligning the period of evaluation with that of the applicable financial reporting requirement? So that's my only comment. Thank you so much.
For the purposes of this, it may be better to deal with comments one by one, because it'll be harder to follow going forward. Anyone else on the same point? Diane?
Yep, I had the same exact comment. I thought that and I understand, the rest of the document. When you look at that table section, it does seem to imply that the auditor needs to make an assessment over the time period, where the reality of the fact is management's got to follow the reporting framework. All the auditor can do is say, yep, management complied with the reporting framework and went out far enough. The auditor, I don't think, should ever be in a position to say, they needed to go further. Time wasn't sufficient. It's all in the context of the applicable reporting standards. So I thought that was actually a pretty critical clarification to put in the table in that section too.
Anyone else on this point? Josephine?
I mean, I understand that, and I understand that I understand both your concerns on this, but we did actually want to strengthen all of this box to make sure that in all cases we have to take into account the framework. And it's so therefore, if anything, we've actually made it more robust in the sense that we have to, as a working group, stand back from this and think, whatever we're doing, are there restrictions? So we feel that actually that's strengthened it and not weaken that piece. And, in terms of that particular, I understand in terms of that particular wording, Chun-Wei, that's been there for quite a while now. So it would be useful to know if other board members want us to put that wording back in, and then we'll be happy to. But then it sort of slightly undermines the point of paragraph 34. So just maybe a couple more comments from other board members, Tom, would help us just work out what we need to do here.
So the alternative is just to put the words back in.
Yeah.
Okay. Anyone else on this point? I personally don't see any problem with adding the words back in. It still requires us to do the action and potential strengthening. It's just reminds people that the relationship of the financial reporting framework, it may be slightly redundant, but if that's important for people. I don't view that as a fatal flaw from my perspective. Are people comfortable with that? Josephine, you comfortable with that?
Yeah, no, totally.
Okay. So for the public record, to reinsert the deletion, we're not changing the initial element, but reinserting that deletion about the financial reporting framework. Any other comments on that section? Okay, Sue.
Thanks. I had two comments on the document as a whole. I mean, there's I think a lot of the points have been addressed. I think the team has done a really good job. The first one might sound like wordsmithing, but I think it's quite an important one. In paragraph 3, we talk about material uncertainty relating to going concern, and we've then abbreviated it, and we use MURGC elsewhere in the document. I feel that by doing that, we're potentially overcomplicating things, and this is an area where there is a lack of understanding about what we do. We only use the term about 5 times during the document, so my preference would really be to spell it out, because it explains what it is that we're talking about, rather than creating something that is over complex. So that's point 1. And point 2 was to thank the team for enhancing the reference to IASB as a key stakeholder in the work that we need to do there. And there's reference in paragraph 40 where it calls out IASB as a particular stakeholder to engage with. My request was whether we could replicate that in the table in 45, which talks about the outreach which we're doing with people in the financial reporting ecosystem. If that could be consistent with paragraph 40 to reference specifically that group, again, I think that would reiterate the importance that we place on their work. Thank you.
Okay. So getting rid of the abbreviation for MURGC, which, since I dislike acronyms anyway, so I'd be supportive of that. Is that fine? And then the question is whether to give a more specific reference to the IASB in the table under 45. Josephine, any view on that?
Yes. I agree with Sue, and you stand back from it. Actually, ironically, we abbreviate something that's already complicated to understand. So I think as I saw nods around the board as Sue was talking to that point. So I think we will just go ahead and make that change, and agreed, it's not just wordsmithing. In terms of the table, now I haven't talked to staff about this directly, but obviously all the working group, but I think what we probably could do, rather than just put that all the way through, is do a footnote to the first instance of that, back to paragraph 40, to say paragraph 40 describes who these are, or obviously words to that effect. So we would footnote that first bullet back to paragraph 40, and I wondered if that would be a possible way forward. So back to you, Tom, with that one.
Sue's nodding. Anyone object? Footnote back to paragraph 40 in the table. Okay. It's done. Diane.
Thanks, Tom. And since I came in a little hot before, let me first of all thank Josephine and the team for the revisions. I thought you took a lot of the comments into consideration. I think it's a really good document. The only other comment that I had, and I'm curious as to just the others' thoughts on this, it is a bit of a wordsmithing, but I think there's a nuance to it. It is underneath the project objectives. It is little c in paragraph 19, and it's the placement of the words where appropriate. So the enhanced transparency with respect to the auditor's responsibility and work related to going concern where appropriate, comma, including strengthening communications and reporting requirements. It's that placement of where appropriate. Is everybody ultimately comfortable with it there versus being at the end of the sentence? It's the question as to, obviously, when does the where appropriate come into? I kind of feel like it might be more appropriate at the end of the sentence. The whole package, we want to strengthen and enhance that transparency, and all of it is subject to where appropriate. So I've gone back and forth, and so that was my only comment, was the placement of those words. But again, I think overall the changes that you made were quite responsive, and really appreciate all the hard work. Thanks, Tom.
Not saying that we were great at drafting in the last round, but my understanding is why it found itself there was that it was consistent with how we did it on fraud. As I said, that's not necessarily any set in stone. Is that correct, team? Or not?
Yeah, that's right. And when we discussed it at the board meeting last week, that seemed to be a fair solution to align it. I mean, my slight hesitation, but obviously open to board's comments on this, my slight hesitation is if we move that where appropriate, then those who are comparing the projects are then thinking, well, what's the difference here? When in fact, the enhancement of transparency was much more favoured in respect to going concern project than it was in fraud, which is why fraud is taking a slightly different direction. So I feel, if anything, if we start shifting it, it might draw unnecessary or negative attention to the reporting piece. And we're trying to be very positive about the reporting piece. But ultimately, we just wanted to align it. Yeah.
Thank you. Okay.
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 People could live with the way it's drafted. Okay, perfect.
Thank you.
Sachika.
Thank you, Tom. And first of all, thank you, Josephine and your team. I think I echo others' point. I think it's very responsive to the board comment. So I really support the direction. And sorry, my comment is a very, very minor one, which is on paragraph 34. From middle, it says the going concern task force in blah, blah, blah will take into account international financial reporting framework requirements and related to the going concern assumption. And for me, the last bit, which is and related to the going concern assumption, is not very clear to me. Maybe and between requirement and related be not needed, or some wording is missing between and related. It's very minor point, but it's just a matter of clarification, I think. That's my comment. Thank you.
Thank you, Sachiko. Josephine?
Yes, Sachiko, you raised a good point, and we did receive some comments before this morning, so thank you to those board members, and many had picked up this. This is my fault because I did some last minute drafting when we sent the turnaround back. It should read essentially that it's missing some wording, so it should read that I'm just going to go from the third line. Will take into account international financial reporting framework developments and requirements related to the going concern assumption. So shall I read out the whole paragraph, Tom? Would that be appropriate? Okay, so it says in paragraph 34, while the IAASB in its standard setting activities endeavours to remain framework neutral, the going concern task force, in addressing the proposed actions that will be further deliberated by the IAASB, will take into account international financial reporting framework developments and requirements related to the going concern assumption. I see nods, but Tom, back to you.
Okay. Any other comments that people want to raise? I think we love standbacks right now, and I just want to ask the board, Janine.
Yes, thanks. Good morning to everyone, or evening. I have a question on 26H and the key issues section. And my question is to understand why in under number 1 and 3, there was the word changed to that it's about the transparency. I'm I'm looking for the right paragraph that I can read it out loud to you. Okay, there's a change, like it's about the transparency. So the communication with those charged with governance ongoing concern may not be sufficiently robust. And under 3, it says the auditor's report may not be sufficiently transparent. And it's in that section where the other things that are mentioned, like where issues related to going concern are identified by the auditor, there is a need to clarify the auditor's responsibilities. And also the other one is very definitive, like it's, yes, there is a need for change or to look into this matter. But now for 1 and 3, it is changed into may. While I understood, but that's also my question, that from the outreach done, there was broad support, or at least also the idea, and the people had a strong feelings that there is a need for further transparency, so enhanced transparency also from the auditor. And why is it? Because the auditor can only be transparent through its auditor's report to users. So why has this change been made? Because it now looks as if the project will sort of find out whether there is indeed a need for further transparency. While I thought that was already clear from the outreach that you've all done. The only thing that was still open is how then this enhanced transparency should be achieved, and how to do that in practice through revising the standards. But so that's my question. So I think it's a little bit too. My feeling was based on what I've read that this is now too weak, so to say. I could give a wrong impression maybe on your intentions with the whole project.
Josephine, do you want to explain some of our thinking on this?
Yeah, so thank you, Jean. Yeah, so we'll focus on H really, because it does feed through to the proposed action. So in terms of the first point, we did receive several comments on the communication with those charged with governance. So it's a matter of when you're trying, instead of having, for example, 27 issues raising every individual comment, you have to take all of them into account and try and represent the key issue as best you can. And the point here was that there may well be already robust communications, but in certain cases we may need to enhance that where that's actually not occurring. And so that's why we use that particular language there. And that was more reflective of the various comments that we got on this particular point. And then where we have in point 3, that the auditor's report may not be sufficiently transparent, that recognizes that there are jurisdictions that have already introduced enhanced transparency requirements in respect to going concern. So it's too definitive to suggest that that is the case in all, or this is the case in all cases. So that's why we went back to the feedback and made sure that the actual risk was better aligned with what we heard in that particular case.
From a work perspective of our board, remember, this is what we heard in the environment. I don't think it changes our actions as a standard setter, where we will robustly consider the transparency requirements, both in terms of communications with those charged with governance and also its implications for the auditor's report and other external communications. That is how I read it. And, I think I've as much focus on the action now. I believe that many do believe that it's not sufficiently robust, but we did hear others who felt like it is. Willie?
Tom, I just wanted to add, I think that aligns also with how we've changed the objective around transparency now to align it with how we've the same construct in the audit in the fraud project proposals. So I think our objective is also now much clearer, that it is focused on enhancing transparency where appropriate.
Okay.
Thanks for your clarifications.
Okay. As I said, it will change the robustness of our consideration of this topic as part of the project. Okay, well, I want us to do a little bit of a stand back before we go. Is there anything, having thought about this project proposal, that we have missed that would lead us to an incomplete consideration of all the public interest issues, or insufficient interaction with our stakeholder community? I don't see any hands on that. I personally believe that that we have a really robust project proposal here, and that it should be ready for a vote of the board. You know, I think for the public record, it may be useful to summarize the changes that we're making as a result of this conversation. Is someone prepared to do that on behalf of the working group?
I'm going to call on Sally Ann and Kalina. I didn't really take notes, so I can't, but there weren't very many, that's for sure.
There were like 3, I think.
Okay, well, I'll start, and then Sally Ann and Kalina can jump in if I've missed something. So we are, in terms of the, bear with me, I'm just going to open up the action. In terms of the proposed actions, we're just going to add back in action 2, in doing so, consider applicable financial reporting framework requirements that address the timeline for assessment, in response to Chun Wee's point. In relation to the abbreviation of material uncertainty related to going concern, MURGC, we're going to remove the abbreviation and use the full phraseology there throughout the project proposal. In terms of making reference to IASB, what we're going to do is we're going to, in our, I'll just do the exact paragraph, sorry, which is in paragraph 45, in terms of our project timeline priorities. In the first instance, where we have a bullet point, which is dialogue and engagement with others in the financial reporting ecosystem as deemed necessary, we're going to do a footnote there that refers the reader back to paragraph 40, where it explains what that is about more fully. And I believe we are then, the last thing I believe is that we're actually just going to make the amendment to paragraph 34, which I read out loud to the board. Sally Ann, have I got everything?
That's my list as well, yes.
Anyone think of anything that we're missing? Okay, are we ready to vote on the approval of this project proposal? Any objections to that? Okay, so for the purposes of the approval of project proposal, remember that just a simple majority is required. But we'll start off, is there any opposition, dissent to approval of this project proposal? Please raise your hand. I see none. Anyone want to abstain from the approval of the project proposal? Raise your hand. Okay, by show of digital hands, all those who approve the project proposal with the amendments suggested. Okay, let it be shown for the record that we have a unanimous majority of 18 board members. All board members are on the call today. So congratulations to Josephine, the Going Concern Working Group, the staff, Bev, Kalina, Sally Ann, and on the board for the approval of the project proposal. Great work with this. As they say, the hard work is still ahead of us on this project, but it's great to see that we've got this important public interest topic fully on our work plan now. Janine, I don't know if you came in earlier, but if you have any observation, I know this is a key project in the mind of the PIOB.
Yes, thanks, Tom. Well, congratulations with the approval of this very important project. As I said before, this is a key project, the way we look at it from a public interest perspective, because it is also meant to narrow the expectation gap. And I also want to say that, well, I already mentioned actually last Monday some key elements that we consider important, and those are reflected in the project plan as adopted. So yeah, we're happy that you can all start working from now on this very important project.
Thank
So
you.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Janine. What I want to give people an opportunity to prepare for the next section, which is PI. Josephine, do you want a short break as we switch over, or are you happy to continue going?
I'm happy to continue going.
Okay, I think that's probably best. We've only been on for 40 minutes. So we're gonna do the exact same thing with listed entities at PI draft that we just did, which I hope by same thing is unanimous approval, but we'll go through the process in the exact same way. So I'll turn it back to Josephine to talk about what the turnaround draft.
Okay, super. More thanks. And actually, Tom, you reminded me. So I just want to say, in terms of going concern, I forgot to thank Bev, who of course was instrumental in pulling all this work together in the first place. So thank you, Bev, for all your help with that. So in terms of PI, thank you to the PI working group and Kalina, Natalie and Billy, who all battled through the drums and the bagpipes last Wednesday as we turned this document around. So thank you for that. Also, extend our thanks to Ken, Jeff and IAASB for working with us so promptly last week on a resolution and agreement of our approach to the review engagements. That was a wonderful example of quick coordination. And similar to going concern, what I'm going to do now is report back on the more, what we believe are the more substantial areas of change. So we're just going to get right to it. So Michelle, if you could move to the next slide, and hopefully this time I've got the right notes like last time. Right, so in terms of the clarification to the project scope, we have made a few tweaks in the introductory text as well to make it clearer that the revisions made to part 4, the revisions were made to part 4A of the code. And in the footnote, of course, we've explained that this is relevant now to audits and reviews. So it brings context to our conversation later in the scope. And so we have now set out our approach to the review standards as discussed and supported by the board and IAASB last week. In the project proposal, we've made a number of changes in several places to remove any indication that we have predetermined the outcome about the mechanism for disclosure. And of course, that flows through the objective, key issues and proposed actions. In terms of the project objectives, we've of course clarified objectives A and D in response to comments from the board, and we've extended the previous objective B into 2 objectives. So new B relates to the objective and guidelines for differential requirements, and of course new C is focused on amending the existing differential requirements for PIs if appropriate. In terms of the key issues, we have incorporated suggested changes from board members here, including the additional clarification that differential requirements are for certain entities. And we've also fixed instances where we use different wording in relation to those entities, such as entities, certain types of entities, and certain entities. So we've now made sure that's aligned with what we use in ISO 540. And then lastly, in terms of the timeline, as discussed at the board meeting, we did believe that 90 days in track 1 is an appropriate period of time, but we did delete that reference to 90 days for track 2. And we've also added a footnote to explain that of course, the final decision on the exposure period will be made at that ED approval point. So Tom, that concludes our report back on the more substantive areas of change for the PI project. So back to you. Thank you.
Thanks, Josephine. Okay, I'd welcome substantive comments on the revised project proposal. Isabel.
Yes, hello everybody from Paris. I just want to thank the working group for the changes that have been made on the scope and the way the review engagements have been incorporated into the project. I think the approach that has been retained is reasonable, and so thanks for what has been done. Thank you.
Okay. Anyone else like to come in? By that, seeing no hands, does that mean that people are comfortable with the revisions that have been made? Okay, I think that's a sign that this project has been discussed in some detail, probably just if I remember over the last couple of years, because it's entailed a huge amount of coordination with our IAASB colleagues. I'd like to, just as I did on the previous project proposal, just to take a pause, say, is there anything as a board that we're missing in this project in terms of topics, outreach, considerations? I think this is really a much more narrow scope project, so I don't see anything, but I do think it's worth a pause before we go to approval. Okay, I see nothing. Billy?
Tom, I just wanted to make sure, because there weren't any other comments, I just wanted to check with staff. There might be a few editorials and things like that that we will just clear as part of the internal process. So the board should just be aware that subject to that, that's the vote that will take place.
Yes, it's consistent with our normal process. We don't want to have a mispunctuation remark or a poor choice of article or anything like that, but editorials. Okay, so understand that no other changes will be made other than editorial remarks. So I think we're ready to vote on the approval of this project plan. We'll do it the exact same way. Is there anyone who objects to the approval of this narrow scope project proposal? I see no hands objected. Anyone who wants to abstain from the approval of this project proposal? I see no hands. For the record, all those who approve of the project proposal raise their hands. Okay. So we had all 18 board members raise their hands on this project. So it is approved. So congratulations again to Josephine, the PI working group, the staff involved, Natalie and Kalina, the board. I think I also want to say thank you to our IAASB colleagues for their coordination and cooperation in this effort. So again, the hard work is ahead of us, but I'm pretty confident that based upon the discussion last week where we talked about a lot of the substance of the first ED, we're in good shape. Like last time, Janine, I don't know if you would like to share any of your observations on this project from a PIOB perspective.
Thanks, Tom. Yes, as I indicated, as the PIOB, we consider the enhanced transparency and consistency key objectives in the public interest for this project. And yeah, I like to encourage you for going forward to obtain sufficient input through targeted stakeholder outreach, in particular to users, investors, other users, in relation to the enhanced transparency on the independence requirements and how that could best be achieved. as that's a big question mark still. So yeah, very good that this project can get started, and congratulations with the adoption of the project plan, and yeah, also for all the other working groups and task forces. A lot of work has gone through these projects, and that was very good also for me when I was in New York in person observing the meeting. Then you get much better feeling and from what all the hard work that goes into this, and everyone working on it outside of the public sessions. So yeah, a lot of respect for that. And so do you want me to also make some more general comments, Tom, or should I?
1 second,
you?
we'll come
Yeah.
back to those in a second, but
Yeah.
thank you for those remarks. I just wanted to offer the opportunity to Josephine, having approved, gotten 2 project proposals approved at this meeting from a working group chair perspective, if there's any reflections you'd like to give.
Thank you. No, just again to reiterate my thanks to the working group members and the staff who've been involved. And I do have to call out Kalina, because she's been on both of these as well and has had to really try and concentrate very hard to work out which project that she's in at one particular point when we're sharing solutions and ideas. But super thanks to the board as well for sending in comments and solutions. And even those little grammatical nits, they're really difficult to see sometimes when you're writing the detail, and so they're really, really helpful. So yeah, thanks to everybody. It's our project proposal as a board, and we should, and staff, and we should be very proud.
Thank you, Josephine, and thank you to the team and staff and all involved on both these project proposals. So Janine gave you a little bit of a preview. We're going to actually do our formal closing remarks this morning, even though we have one session this evening. The reason for that is the session this evening has breakout groups and is really focused on action. So it would be a little awkward to come back and convene and give some closing remarks. So we'll do that now. And Janine, you've observed, and I appreciated your last remarks, but you have some general observations from the PIOP perspective that you'd like to share.
Yes, thanks, Tom. Yeah, overall, I think, yeah, very constructive meeting. And as I said, very good that I could be in person there. So I really appreciated that. Well led. Also, I also noticed that if there was outreach done, that public interest issues were again repeated, reiterated, or had to put attention to those by the chair. So, and that's something we also, of course, look at as PIOB and like to see, because we're there. It's our role to look after the public interest being served. So what I also liked in particular is the presentations that were given when the meeting started on a particular topic, project, with the slides that covered the offline comments received by the board members and how these were dealt with on a high level. So because that gave me also a flavor of what kind of topics were already discussed, maybe offline, and what was the outcome of that, and also the CAC input and the SMP input received, because that provides also a sort of a basis for the discussions. And I was actually thinking about that, whether it would also maybe be an idea if, as a start, also there would be a slide with the PIOB public interest issues. And maybe also, since you also already started working with the PIF, the public interest framework, in which you have the objectives or the qualitative characteristics you want to focus on in your projects, that you maybe also highlight those at the start of the real discussions at the board meeting, to have everyone's focus directed at all those elements. Those are typically public interest, relevance for the public interest, I think, all those slides in the beginning. So I think that would be, that's very good. And I would like to suggest that you add also the other things I mentioned at the start of your discussions. So yes, that's my feedback, and I all wish you well with progressing the projects, and I will be your observer at the next meeting as well in June. Looking forward to that. Thank you.
Thank you, Janine, and appreciate those suggestions. I hope we will be seeing everyone in person in June. So let's hope that the trend continues in the direction. So I want to. This has been a robust this week of discussions, and we have a big one tonight on sustainability reporting assurance. So I think there's more to come, but anyone observing our board will see that we're serious on acting on some of the most challenging topics facing audit and assurance. And so thank you to all for your participation and for all those involved in the preparation of the discussions and materials. Draft meeting minutes will be distributed to the board for comment in due course. It will be posted for approval at the June 2022 meeting. We're making an effort that we're going to follow our new approach to minutes, so expect them to be ready in rapid order and be useful for the task forces and working groups to progress the work. The IAASB meetings for the Q2 of 2022 are as follows. A video conference has been planned for April 26th. The calls and details of the content will be confirmed in due course. The next IAASB board meeting will be held on June 13th through 17th. Also, we're still finalizing the details, but actually I will turn to Willy to give you a little bit of a preview of coming attractions.
Thank you, Tom. I just need to get that voice that the person does on the trailers for movies. So just to confirm to the board, the April 26th board call will be used. So we will definitely have that call, and that call will be used for the CASP to look at the CASP drafting principles and guidelines and try to finalize version 1.0 of the CASP principles and guidelines. You will remember that the original idea was actually to bring it to this meeting, but because we had to pivot to a virtual agenda, we lost some plenary time, and that's why it's moved to the April call. So we will definitely use the April call. And then for the June meeting, just a little bit of a flavor for the topics that we think will be on the agenda. And this is in the context that we are looking at a full in-person meeting in June. And again, depending on circumstances, closer to the time, we may have to make adjustments. But on that basis, that we hopefully will have a full meeting agenda for June. The items that will be coming to the board will be ISA for LCE, and that will be the LCE task force's first report back to the board on the comments that we've received on exposure and on some of the key themes and the overarching themes that we need direction from the board in terms of finalizing the LCE standard. So that will be a very substantive session. Last week, Sue did indicate to you that you will see the audit evidence standard again in June. So based on the excellent input we got from board members last week, the working group will continue to turn the standard. So you will see a second draft of the full standard, but there will also be other items that will be brought to the board. For example, the conforming and consequential amendments out of the ISA 500 project. We will continue with the fraud project. You saw that last week we had some issues that were discussed with the board. The task force will continue to develop some of the other issues and bring that to the board in Q2 for the June meeting. Going concern, now that the project proposal has been approved, the task force, and we now have a task force, they can begin developing the issues based on the project proposals and the proposed actions. So some of those issues will be brought to the board for discussion in June. We will have one approval at the June meeting. So on the PI project, remember we bifurcated that into two work streams. and we will continue with workstream 1, and we hope to approve an exposure draft in June for workstream 1 that specifically focuses on the transparency about relevant ethical requirements for independence. And then, depending, Tom did make reference to the discussion we still have to have this afternoon on sustainability. You will see in the sustainability paper, it was indicated that the next substantive discussion with the board will be in September, but depending on the discussion this afternoon and also the progress of the work, we might have a very short or quick, at least an update session to the board on sustainability or ESG. But like I said, that is subject to this discussion this afternoon and seeing how we progress with the work after this March meeting. And then there may be one or two smaller topics that come in, but I think those will be the major items on the agenda, Tom.
Thank you, Vili. And one quick question for you is that we still have 2 times held for the April meeting. Have we decided yet whether it will be morning or afternoon Eastern Daylight Time?
Yeah, normally that's driven by the task force chair, and the task force chair, the working group chair is Isabel. So we haven't decided yet, but just based on that principle, I think it will probably be a morning session.
Okay, thank you. We'll confirm that, but I think it's useful for people, for their calendars to have that signal now. Thank you all. So the next, just a couple of other things. Just the next CAG meeting is scheduled for September 6th to 8th. Again, we will talk to everyone well in advance about who's needed at that session, task force or work group chairs who may attend, and the agenda is yet to be determined. As always, for video conferences, papers will be posted 7 to 8 days prior to the video conference. For our June meeting, I know you're anxious to get the papers already. We'll probably begin posting on May 16th, and all materials should be posted by May 27th. So thank you. This ends the public session of our board meeting. I'm asking people to stay on for an administrative session afterwards. So Michelle, when that's all